We've got two panels to report on. Ours determines the future of the city operations. We were very lucky to have amongst our group a couple of folks, actually 3 people, maybe 4 people, actually worked in cities. A lot of time in IBM we spend conjuring up scenarios. Well, we didn't have to conjure up any scenarios here. We had them real and live from the folks in the audience. We started off sort of taking Colin's initial framework and thinking about some initial ideas. We wanted to see, did we validate the approach? Our approach was actually to take a set of scenarios, break them down, and understand how the data flowed amongst the different groups. And we sort of started the initial thoughts. Let me just run down some of them. Jerry's idea was that you can get a lot of data from existing events that happen in cities, particularly traffic. Now, you understand that Jerry is a partner at a company whose focus is on traffic. And I would say, from what you saw yesterday, it was very impressive to see a company like Jerry's both doing work and investing in research. It was very impressive. Both Keith and I sort of discussed this on the way home last night. Ken's thinking was about permitting. Perhaps the focus should really here be on permitting. Now, Ken spent a lot of time in a Californian city, which remained nameless, but unfortunately they don't have him working for them at the time because I think he's retired, if I understand. One day I hope to be there also. But permitting was kind of an embodiment of the key issues, and as Otto went through those issues, it became clear that the whole system sort of runs and works based on permits. Jayant, being a mathematician, actually very skilled in applying a wide variety of mathematics to things as diverse as supply chain and scheduling steel mills. He was really interested in understanding how we could apply this kind of analytics to the unstructured data, which is everywhere in cities. Then there's a question of the data itself and the description of that data, the metadata, and the problems that everybody has with making it clean and making it available. Steve, who's at the university here, and is an engineer by trade, wanted to understand how we could apply sensing and analytics to develop a holistic view of the system. Could we build kind of a model based on these sensors and the actuators that could represent a city? And Charlie from Argonne wanted to see, all right, so we've got these processes in cities that started off as being manual and analog. What would happen when we made them digital? Could we actually restructure the processes? And obviously, as you look at the data, there's correlations that are obvious, but there's data that starts being very interesting. For example, I'm looking for an example, and I can't find it. Charlie will give it to us later. Thank you, Charlie. Karin, I think, he was from the legal office in Oakland. Is that right, Karen? Which surprised me. I thought, goodness gracious, we've got a lawyer in the group. But it was very helpful because the sharp end of the stick often in the city are the legal issues that one has to deal with. And one of the questions she brought up, and it's one that comes up everywhere, is how do we deal with requests for public information? What kind of data should be allowed to be disseminated? What kind of data needs to be retained? It's a question every city is battling with today. Beatrice's view of the world is a complex view of the world. Not that she's complex, it's just that she looks at complex systems and unravels them and figures out how to organize, restructure, and rebuild systems, which is very helpful for us because she took on a piece of the task later on. And the question was, we should be focusing on outcomes, surely, and as we change the underlying infrastructure, how does that underlying infrastructure change the nature of the organization? Otto gave some examples of deep understanding of events and real causes. So, for example, there might be some graffiti in a particular area. Just removing it won't solve the problem, because it could be a tag from what you called a clique, which is a new kind of gang, as I understand it. Is that right, Otto? Or it could be sort of an indication that gangs are going to, as it were, gang up on each other. So there's a lot of information there that you need to analyze, not just in the moment or in the location, but look at it at its whole, as it were, life cycle. Pat, who works at Esri, wanted to really understand, not only as we looked at the whole system, were we managing the customer who is the citizen or the denizen, but how were we managing the internal processes and making sure they weren't overwhelming what really had to be done for the customer. And Colin's view was that responsiveness of city to its denizens, and we use the word denizens since it seems about as politically correct as you could get, and how could the IT make the city more responsive? And so we started looking at a number of examples. One is a special event, which again requires a permit. For example, a block party, a 5K run, a festival. There was even a festival, I'll tell you about that later. It all has to do with animals. Sort of looking at things from a higher level, there are a number of city actions that then help characterize what goes on with the activity. They need to look at the day, the characteristics of the event, map to what Otto said the city looks like, i.e. what's the state of the city, and how do we perturb the state of that city with the event that's being requested. Things like the status of the streets. Is somebody digging them up? Is somebody going to dig them up? Or is somebody going to put markers on the street, fence off a street because there's going to be a crane put up there? There's a whole set of issues which you normally don't think about, but you have to if you're going to manage these events. We looked at a number of agencies: Public Works, Parks. Actually, didn't do much with Parks after we wrote the name down. Police. We looked at things like cost permitting. We discussed the fact that we had to manage, in most cases, resources against some objective, and how to deal with conflicts in the resolution. And in the end, there had to be an agreed and common outcome. So this is kind of the table that we sort of listed, and although it seems quite, shall we say, brief, it took a lot of time to put this together. So for example, if you look at the agency called Public Works, what is their role? Well, they manage the city infrastructure. The roads, the sewers, the buildings, the bridges, a variety of different components, and their objective is to ensure space is available and safe for, in this case, the event. So they need data. They need to know if there are any construction holds. They need to know if they have the resources to support the event. They need to know about conflicting event. They need to know what the event requirements are. They need to know external factors such as weather, unplanned events, emergencies, the president comes to town, or one of these disruptions. And the data they provide are permits and permit details for other agencies. That's about it. If you look at traffic, on the other hand, their job is to keep the traffic moving against a set of objectives, usually make it easy to move traffic through the city. There's very few cities that move traffic through to minimize carbon, for example. It's not possible to do that yet. But it will be, I believe. And so their objective is to minimize congestion and, quote, deadly embraces, which sounds pretty evil to me. But Otto will explain. Otto, what is a deadly embrace? I never did figure that out. Okay. That you could. That's when you're sitting in the same spot for 30 minutes. Oh, okay. So for the people that are online, Otto said that a deadly embrace is when you're sitting in the same place for 30 minutes. been there, done that. And the data that they need is the location and movement of traffic. They also interestingly need to know the location and activity and availability of parking meters. And as our colleague from Esri, Pat, mentioned, they need a base map. The data they provide is quite broad. It's road availability, it's traffic monitors, the location of those monitors. They provide information to the public, both through the press and other media. They provide information about events. They provide parking availability and optimal routing. Now, interestingly enough, we discovered that in Minneapolis, if a parking meter needs to be put out of use, it's not the traffic agency, but it's actually the police that does that, and so a work order has to be generated for the police. The police, their role is really public safety, traffic control and enforcement. Otto's point was that, you know, if you're thinking the police are sort of tracking what you're doing, sort of using license plate readers and then monitoring that, a lot of that information goes somewhere else for other agencies to deal with. So the police's job is public safety, traffic control and enforcement. And their objective is to prevent conflicts and crime, provide management of the environment and crowd control. The data they really need is information about events, various resource requirements. They need to know where the critical infrastructure is, what they need to protect. They need to know what the activities of crowds and people is, and they need to know, of course, about unplanned events, both emergencies and non-emergencies. And the data they provide, we sat around the table and asking, well, what data do police really provide? We couldn't come up with a lot for this particular, not that we're all experts about what police do, but sort of a general agreement, they provide some level of statistics and some level of reporting about successes. Now, there is an event. These agencies commonly sit together around a table. They share information, and through that sharing, they make decisions. There was one event called the Blessing of the Animals, where, you know, Otto brought this up as an example of a kind of unique event that's held at the Catholic Basilica in Minneapolis. And so the agency that had to be brought there, and I never even thought about this, was animal control. I mean, imagine there's probably a fair amount of cleaning up has to be done after that also. But in this particular, I think the point was there's many situations where you can't use the past to help you predict the future. Although after this one event that has been recorded, Otto pointed out, they will keep the data about the procedures they used, about the agencies that were involved, about the outcomes, and learn from that. But the aspect we got from all of this integrated planning and activity, actually operations, was that it's important to have the flexibility of people use the tools to make the system work. So as much as we'd like to automate everything, there's still a big role for people. And indeed, by having, for example, various parts of the city learn more, for example, some of the unionized workers, there was an agreement that not only if they expanded their role, they would have a broader scope of things to deal with, they'd learn more, become more valuable, which is actually quite appropriate. And so kind of the next stage for us was, how do we improve the process? Okay, we got this table, we have an idea of where data flows, we got an idea how the system works. And for those of you who didn't see the Integrated Operation Planning Center that Minneapolis has put in place, you should probably look at the charts that are online that Otto provided. It brings data together, it provides one view of the activities and enables the collaboration against that data. So we asked, you know, what does improving the process really mean? There was some thought that some automation might be part of this. There certainly was the idea that presentation of the information to the participants in equally understandable ways using jargon that everybody understood was of vital importance. And then being able to access the information with different modes, connectivity, device, methodology, which John McCabe, for example, showed us that, what's it called, spot, click, fix, something like that? See, click, fix, excuse me, thank you. These different modes that can get you that same information and provide it. And providing a digital submission process would probably change the whole process, but it's very expensive to go from where we are now to making everything completely digital. And you need to understand the ROI and the evolution of the system to be able to deal with that. So really, what is improvement? Improvement, we believe, is improved customer satisfaction. So when the customer comes to the city and is part of the client is part of the decision-making process, the level of satisfaction goes up because they see that they're making the process work and the outcomes are the ones they want and the outcomes come back quickly. Obviously, another part is if the event the customer has is successful and they can see the cause being the fact that the process was simple, they could get involved with it and they could manage it, provides another level of satisfaction. And obviously, convenience and speed of city response is vital. Working in a Kafkaesque environment is probably the death knell for politics. Then, of course, reduced cost of planning and implementation, very important with today's world in the United States and Europe, where there's less and less money for government. And the other part of this is, as information flows around, so the city leadership can understand better what's going on and adapt to it, instead of taking stabs in the dark and saying, hey, Mrs. Jones, how do you like, what was it Mayor Koch used to say, how am I doing? Remember that? Then, of course, there's political credit, which is always taken by those who are in politics for the work that's done by those who are hired by them. In addition, there is improved collaboration and a different view of the future from this esprit de corps, and ultimately this empowered workforce. We started looking at what could be automated, and I can't say we got through to the end of this process, but I would say Beatrice did a great job in taking us through this sort of change process. Clearly, those who don't learn from the past, as Santayana said, are doomed to repeat it, and keeping the past actions, learning from them, establishing the patterns is of vital importance to make this thing move forward and improve. Then changing the worker from a specialist to a generalist, a difficult task if the worker feels like their job is threatened, if they're trying to outsource the job to Lower Podunk, New York, or whatever it might be. So providing the skills, enabling the individual worker who's cocooned in this, cocoon's the wrong word, who's sort of constrained in one silo, and giving them more ability to use their skills, can be a very uplifting and really expanding experience. And then, ultimately, what we want to do is not automate the hell out of everything. Obviously, you can't. First of all, you can't. And secondly, even if you did, there'd be that one event you never thought about that really needs a superior computing engine, the human being, to drive it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to continue this work. We'll post this information to the Urban Systems Collaborative blog. The Mechanizations Takes Command is a book I need to read. Sorry, just put that down. And we really invite those of you in the audience to continue to contribute to that blog. With that, any questions or comments, please. I actually would like to thank our members from those city agencies that made all the difference in the world. If they hadn't been there, we would have been conjecturing things. So thank you to all.
Just a general comment. I'm glad the symposium was held. I was hoping, though, and maybe that could be done in another symposium, I'm hoping that the private industry, which generates a lot of the technology that we see at the cities, and I was a city worker, okay. I'm hoping they go back from the symposium and figure out how to help us out.
Yeah.
They've got to come up with the software, whatever they got to do, the hardware, the software, the techniques, and the education of the city workforce to make some of these changes, because we're swamped with work and our workforce is low, and society wants more services all the time. So it's starting to be a big gap, and I think this symposium tried to address that, and information is a big chunk of that.
Thanks very much, Ken. And by the way, again, I want to mention this, and for people who are streaming, there's a Beverly Willis Foundation in New York, Beverly Willis, whose focus is on helping women in the construction, planning, engineering, and architecture trades and professions. Beverly really started that work because she looked at the history of architecture and found there's surprisingly few women in that history, whereas she knew there were a lot more. Anyway, get in touch with Beverly, she can help. Thanks very much.
So I can't claim any of the degree of specificity or even inspiration in our discussion, but I can say that we tried very deliberately to think about where all of this is going and think about the image we gave ourselves at the beginning of the conversation was this tentatively imagined textbook on how one goes about thinking about information and technology in the systems of a city. And what we would need the chapter or chapters of that book that would deal directly with the idea of citizen engagement and data democracy to include. This led to the kind of outline that shaped our discussion, which was first to imagine, if we could be so presumptuous, what a definition of citizen engagement would be in this context. Two, to attempt to categorize, give frameworks to, or even caveats to the idea of citizen engagement enabled by technology. And I won't be giving away the punchline when I say there are far more caveats in this entire presentation than anything else. And finally, to look at some specific use cases and examples, more empirically and illustratively than in the framework in the presentation that Yuri just gave you, but as a way of imagining what the, let's say, the limits to the kind of cone of possibilities might be, and thus how we could kind of generate the larger space which all of the possibilities of technologically enabled citizen engagement would describe. So this PowerPoint, by the way, is dispiritingly all the things a PowerPoint shouldn't be, which is to say an outline of exactly what I'm saying to you versus a, because we used it as a kind of collaborative tool to generate what we were saying. So really maybe don't look at the slide, but rather listen. And I think one of the most important takeaways that we had from our conversation was that unlike, for example, potentially the role of technology in infrastructure or in urban operations, the role where technology is the thing itself, maybe as dumb as a sewer, but it is still a piece of technology. The dynamics of citizen engagement enabled, mediated by technology, are enormously and indescribably complex. In particular, we were struck by the way in which the citizen engagement, democracy, whatever you call it, is the underlying dynamic of cities, the underlying subtle, networked, amazing dynamic of cities. And that we punted on attempting to encapsulate that in a singular definition, but rather said that this is an underlying phenomena that is separate from technology, but is increasingly mediated by it. And we need to pay particular attention to how technology can improve and dignify and engage that existing dynamic rather than be an end in itself. We also understood that citizen engagement, while this larger conference has been focused quite a bit on what centralized administrations and governments can do in cities, citizen engagement does not necessarily always involve government at all. And there are, in fact, important ways that technology can enable citizen engagement with the city, quite separate from citizen engagement with the government. So that is also a very important point. Finally, on this slide, the engagement is we will provide a definition for engagement, and what we mean by engagement is not just a one-way process. You don't press a button on a black box. That black box has to do something back at you in order for you actually to be engaged with it. So we're not just purely interested in one-way processes of collecting data or providing information, but really thinking fundamentally about dynamic interactions around data and around technology as the focus of this conversation. And in this, while we didn't define so much a framework for citizen engagement, we did really feel like we had to define precisely what we meant by technology in this context. And in particular, we tried to shape our conversation around thinking about what technology can help us do in the city, which is a fairly limited but very powerful set of things. Technology can improve communication. It can improve precision either of data or of the spatial position of data. It can improve radically the recording and retrieval of data. This is, as far as we could figure out, the limits of what it can do, which is not to say that technology is limiting. In fact, it's enormously enabling, but it is enabling in places where these specific things are fundamental to the dynamic that's already going on, or where the addition of these things can fundamentally change the dynamic of the situation. So on to the kind of meat of our discussion, much of which focused on the trying to give a framework to our conversation, trying to give caveats to warnings, if you will, to technologists reading our textbook, trying to deal with these issues, and trying at the very end to kind of categorize or describe the many different kinds of engagement that technology in the city can help instrumentalize. Our tool, one of the most important frameworks for our discussion was this ladder of citizen participation in urban administration and government, which the sociologist Arnstein developed in 1969, in which you can see the ways in which urban administration deals with the public can go all the way, anything from using information for manipulation, for a kind of therapy, all the way up through informing, consulting, placating, and finally up to partnering with citizens, delegating power to them, and finally giving citizens a fundamental level of control over what's going on. And technology, there's a way in which we can describe technology being used to do all of these things. Technology itself is rather neutral in that it can have a role in both positive and negative modes of engagement with urban government, but we're particularly interested in the way in which technology can help move interactions up this ladder. That was nothing more than a value judgment on our behalf that movement up this ladder is a positive thing. I have to say that probably about 90% of a conversation was taken up with the next several slides, which is to say that getting together a group of people who are very concerned about cities themselves and very interested in how technology is changing the ways we interact with cities and with each other in cities leads to any number of caveats, only some of which we've described here. First of all, we need to remember that engagement can begin at the top or at the bottom. And it can act to the connection between those two. For a connection between citizens and urban administration to exist, the connection can be made by either one, effectively. Secondly, this goes on the top of our definition, that technology's role in citizen engagement is the most effective when it piggybacks upon, appreciates, and catalyzes existing social and urban dynamics, not when it attempts to wholesale replace these dynamics with new widgets or new technologies. Something like the Obama campaign's effective use of GIS and database management really reflected a deep understanding about how people make political choices based on what their neighbors tell them, based on conversations. It attempted to identify particularly influential neighbors and blocks and act upon them with information, but it did so in a deep appreciation of what those fundamental dynamics were. The other one other a further caveat to this is that we see a lot of examples out there of killer apps, as it were, that seem to want to improve access and communication to government in cities. But we see the most important role of technology in urban context is to be increasing the transparency of the operation of those governments, not just a really beautiful button on the black box, but some glass walls to the black box itself that lets you really see what's going on. This is a really important point about privacy. Privacy is a non-trivial thing in this context, in exchanging and using information in cities, but also a great example of how technology isn't a new thing in cities, but rather something that is shifting, that we see chiefly in its shifting of existing complex dynamics. So the example of this we discussed the most was of the response to the Google Street View in European cities, and the very negative response to that. Now, cities, of course, are already a huge transaction in privacy. If you're living on your own in the country, you can do whatever you want. But in the city, you give up certain degrees of privacy. If you live in an apartment, you give up acoustic privacy in return for being able to live in the dense center of a city and have good access to a whole bunch of different resources. If you live on a street, you make an exchange. You're willing for people to see into your house and to see into other people's house, but they are people you know on your street. The Google Street View car didn't so much create a new dynamic as it did shift the balance of that existing dynamic. Suddenly, with the Google Street View, the entire world of 6 billion people can peer into your yard, and by the same token, you can't see who is doing that peering. And so the technology is sometimes destabilizes the dynamics of cities, but the dynamics of cities are very complex to begin, are a series of very complex transactions to begin with. Technology is, as we sifted through all our various examples, we found that technology can most often find a useful role in a city's existing ecology of communication, all the webs of gossip and information and media that already exist, by making existing channels more effective. There are already channels for people to understand what's going on in government. We can create more of them, we can create better channels, we can create more transparency. Sometimes, however, there is an entirely new dynamic at foot as well, and we'll go through some of those in the examples. Caveat number 75, visualization and legibility are essential to transparency. Design is the means by which this goal is accomplished. This is a small caveat in our list here, but probably a very large caveat in how a kind of textbook or introduction to the subject would be based. The third caveat here, this was the product of a lot of conversations and discussions of examples. The best role for government in the technological dynamic of cities is most often to provide raw data versus necessarily tools for engagement with and comprehension of data. No one is eager to play a government-designed video game, but we can induce many people to do very interesting things if we create playful, enjoyable situations around data that a government provides. Related to the point we made in definitions, it's also important in this regard to remember that government is not the entirety of governance. In fact, if you think about what make cities really work, government is by far the minority of governance. Most governance takes place according to social dynamics of situations, agreements about what we do with each other that do not need to be administered or regulated or enumerated. And an awareness of this dynamic is really useful when you thinking about technology's role in the city. Goodness me, I have 2 more screens of caveats, so I'll go more quickly. Oh no, that's a duplicate. There we go. This is the last screen of caveats. Engagement is not just about power, which is the ladder of engagement might give us. Engagement is itself a kind of value, and engagement creates value. An engaged citizenry creates a city that's more open to entrepreneurship, more open to creation, more open to many things. So we can advocate for engagement, not just in terms of advocating democracy, but also in terms of advocating the actual place of business that the city is. As we said before, technology is itself value neutral. More technology is not necessarily better or worse. It depends on what the technology is doing. citizen engagement, this is a very important point. Citizen engagement, that is to say the way in which the city operates upon itself, and optimization of processes, which is in many ways the underlying dynamic of technological systems, are often or even almost always at cross purposes. You don't make something more efficient or optimize it by letting people be involved in it. In fact, it's more often people mess things up. But the messing up of things by people is also what makes the city itself work. So the balance between optimization and non-optimization in an urban context with technology is going to be very different than it is on the wing of a 747. Participation via technology recapitulates existing democratic dynamics. It can, however, accelerate them and accentuate their effects. The best example, for example, I think it's Conway's law that the length of an online discussion increases geometrically the chance that someone will mention Hitler. So, online discussions tend to degrade very quickly, especially unmediated comment threads and the like into, and this is also true of, for example, public hearings on zoning improvements tend to degrade very quickly if left to their own devices. So this is an existing social dynamic, but on a comment thread it happens in about 10 minutes, whereas in a public meeting it tends to take 4 hours. So the effect of technology in democratic situations is to, as I say, more often accelerate existing dynamics than create entirely new ones. So before you completely tire of the caveats, we'll move on to some of the examples. So we had a very freewheeling, kind of almost circular discussion in which we returned to a series of examples in thinking about what some of these underlying issues are. So here are some of them listed. And these, again, in a textbook would probably be the things that you wanted to unpack the dynamics of and really understand what was happening. In no particular order, we were very interested in the ways in which tools like Solar Boston or SF Environments Calculator that lets you look at your house and understand what wattage you'd save, power you'd save with solar panels, and connects you to contractors who'd like to install those panels, et cetera, et cetera. This is a great example in the way in which information itself is often the best thing that technology can contribute to existing social or urban dynamics. People are always comparing their houses to other people's houses. This is a fundamental dynamic of urban social situations. But when you let them compare it in terms of the solar potential of the house, you alter the dynamic to a productive end in terms of energy efficiency. We talked a lot about NIMBY dynamics and the way in which we would like to think that technology, if it's the example of high-speed rail on the peninsula here in the Bay Area or the subway station in Beverly Hills, one of the things that technology can do with a lower barrier to access is it can potentially enlarge the geographic scope of decisions and controversies so that the level of the scope of the discussion better matches the scope of the larger community that can best benefit from the outcome. I talked a little bit about the dynamics of Facebook usage under favela occupants in Rio de Janeiro, which is booming, which is a good example of how the dynamics of what we've come to call the digital divide are changing, but are still fundamental to the conversation about cities, technology, and public engagement. We talked a little bit about two examples in Bogota, one of which is mentioned here. The first was an entirely open source database of which taxis were safe to take and which were not, that came out of citizen frustration with the kind of highly sketchy dynamics of taking a taxi in Bogota. And it became, because it was so useful, it was adopted quickly and widely, and it fundamentally altered the dynamics of public transportation in the city. So again, governance is not always government, and this is a good example. The other example in Bogota that I don't know why it's not here is the social campaign led by the Bogota mayor 15 years ago, Antanas Mocas, to improve civility in the public sphere on the street. The issuing of cards to pedestrian and drivers that had on the one hand a red down thumb and on the other side a green thumbs up that were used widely in order to suddenly Antanas Mocas was very aware that there was an existing social dynamic that he could harness of reciprocity and communication that could be harnessed to improve the way in which people behaved on the sidewalk. Things needed to be very bad before people were willing to do ridiculous things like hold cards up on the street, but if you gave them the tool, in this case a very simple tool, it could fundamentally change the dynamic of the situation. We talked a little bit about how the legal state of information is crucial. The practitioners amongst us helped us understand some things like the next bus copyright issues that happened here in the Bay Area, where because of the way in which a contract was worded, the information service provider on when your next bus would come suddenly decided that it could and should claim ownership of the information when the next bus would come. And therefore, it hobbled the ability of people to address their API and to create tools that could better allow the city to operate even when superficially it seemed like transparency was being created. And we talked quite a bit about the see-click-fix model and how, again, the technology itself was rather neutral and could swivel on the ladder of participation between placation or partnership, depending on the level of transparency involved and the level at which the citizenry was actually being engaged. Our final conclusions, again, quite a bit of punting going on here, that technology can lower barriers to participation, but it can also, it can help participation take place, and it can alter the speed and nature of participation. But there are fundamental dynamics to citizen engagement and participation that are the much larger bottom part of the iceberg that need to be included in the conversation. Finally, in an attempt to understand why we had found it, why in particular we'd found it so hard to be specific in this conversation, a very interesting, sprawling, complex conversation about citizen participation, but one with very few matrices emerging. We went back to Jane Jacobs, who was amongst the first to note that urban variables, and in particular the variables of social and cultural dynamics that are deeply implicated in the kind of participative situations that cities give a rise to. These variables are often too numerous, too interconnected to be studied in isolation. They are, in fact, as slippery as an eel. So that's our conclusion and, in some way, our justification. And if I've missed anything out, I'd welcome thoughts from those in our group. And if it's totally unclear, I'd welcome thoughts from those in the other group as well.
Thank you very much. Questions, observation, Giant.
Looks like it was a really interesting discussion. I have a couple of questions or clarifications that I guess I'm trying to elicit. One is, it seems like you put a line between what you call fundamental urban dynamics, which seems to be orthogonal to what technology can do. And I'm wondering whether, there are instances where actually technology could bring in new urban dynamics. And the other question or point that I wanted to discuss maybe a little bit is, optimization being at cross purposes with citizen engagement. I'm not sure I fully understand or buy into that argument. Some recent work that we did in IBM research on social engagement seems to suggest to us that actually optimizing and segmenting and targeting the information leads to much better engagement than otherwise. So this is some initial empirical data, right? So I was wondering if maybe you or the larger group can comment on these two things.
Thanks, John.
I don't think. I think it depends on, to answer the second question first, I suppose it really depends on how you think about optimization. If you're attempting to optimize engagement, then that's probably a good way. You're inherently creating a balance. But that discussion about optimization came in the context of a discussion of how often creating good solutions in cities involves moderating citizen engagement and handling it and managing it, the way in which a kind of recurring dynamic in cities which are improving infrastructure and improving equity and access tends to be, for example, a strong elected mayor who has a high degree of accountability but only every 4 years, versus a kind of committee-led, constituency-driven urban government, which often has a very difficult time deciding on any one thing to do in the face of the fact that there's always going to be a vocal minority imposing any single urban intervention. And that dynamic is a very fundamental one in cities, and it's one to which the kind of technological lens needs to apply. So and I think also the idea of optimization came in more that it also relates to this idea of resilience that we were talking about, that a kind of technology or infrastructure optimized for any one single purpose will also tend to be not so robust to other uses and adaptations, but misuse and adaptation is a very underlying dynamic in urban situations. So especially in the kind of in the context of sort of democracy and engagement, and therefore it's again something just to be thoughtful about. Does that answer the question, or?
Yeah, I guess partially. So my response would be that maybe if you look at social choice theory, right, there are several sort of tools that are available to you that might be enabled by the appropriate kind of technology.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the example of what you might call optimizing engagement versus optimizing the systems on which engagement is sought, if that makes sense.
More questions? Ken? Yes.
Yeah, I want to expand on your idea there. There was a city, this was many years ago when the computers just came out, and correct me if anybody remembers, but a Midwestern town, wasn't really a large town, but they were experimenting with direct democracy, where the computer, the city gave them, we're getting into governance now, they gave the residents a certain time frame to decide issues like, do we put the library here or there, or what kind of services do we want to provide, budget things. And you could change your vote. And after talking to other people in town, you could put in your code number and change your vote. And I don't have any follow-up feedback on that. If anybody knows of how that experiment went, I'd sure like to know. But and I want to thank this group too. You've made it clear that cities are not just about governance, and the concrete examples you provided are excellent, and it made me more aware of that, this new technology is allowing people to get together around issues, bring them, and a lot of things are resolved outside of government. And the last thing I wanted to say, your idea, I can't remember where I read it, but I would challenge, or at least think about that idea that technology is neutral. I'm thinking of Marshall McLuhan. I guess that's out of fashion now, but the Medium is a Message, the book that he wrote back in the 60s. Yeah, and certain technologies, maybe not in this group, but if you put it out into the general population, we're all part of that. They look at technology as what can it do right away without thoughts about, do we need to do this? And I think that's echoed in a lot of other books.
Technology is a media, and McLuhan's fundamental point about medium is that media comes from the Latin word for lens, and a lens helps you see in a certain way better, but it also distorts what you're looking at in certain ways and creates biases. So I don't think I think we probably could clarify that point to say technology is not itself a neutral object at all. In fact, it is embedded with all kinds of biases, and in fact tends to resemble, I forget which, this was another one of these great technological laws, but technology tends to resemble most the committee that designed it, in its structure, and it tends to embed all kinds of assumptions within itself. But when in the specific lens of government and democracy, we shouldn't, I think we were more trying to say that we shouldn't necessarily assume that more technology is inherently a good thing in any situation, or that technology will always be the solution. Technology will be the solution when it best appreciates and engages these existing democratic and civic dynamics that we would like to kind of amplify and extend, but it can have the counter-purpose, like the kind of explosion of surveillance in London was something we talked about, is not, in fact, a very democratic thing at all, but it is highly technologically mediated.